Hi, my name is Mark Ackroyd, Head of Advice Delivery, Strategy and Innovation for Lumient. Welcome to Lumient Live, the podcast for advice professionals that believe in a values-based advice experience, but still have that question, how does it all work? The Lumient Live podcast connects listeners with other advice professionals to hear best practice client stories or business examples and lifts the lid on how they made it happen. Today, I'm joined by James Williamson, Managing Director and Senior Financial Advisor of Millhaven Financial Services in Sydney. G'day, James. Thanks for joining us.
G'day, Mark. Nice to be here.
Lovely to have you, mate. So for those of you that don't know James, here's a bit of a practice profile on James and the team at Millhaven so that you can identify where James is coming from. So Millhaven typically deal with pre-retirees and those in the early stages of retirement, plus white-collar professionals. These clients typically have investable assets between $500,000 and $3 million. The team involves 2 advisors plus 4 support staff, and that business manages 133 contracted clients who on average pay a fee of anywhere between $7,000 to $12,000 based on their complexity. James, today you join us and you've brought in a couple client case studies for us to unpack to see how you bring values-based advice to life at Millhaven. So why don't you get us underway and tell us about one of those clients?
Yeah, sure. So just been using Luminant for about 12 months now. So it's been a really interesting experience and really enjoyed that process. It's been a learning pathway, even though we've always done values-based advice. It's lovely to have a structured methodology behind it, which has been really good. But I thought I'd just throw a couple of examples at you today that have really sort of surprised us a little bit over the last 12 months. And they are 2 very different examples. The first one is an interesting one because we've just got to that 12-month anniversary of using Luminant. So we're starting to go through those review processes utilizing the methodology. Right, so it's been really interesting because there's a little bit of learning involved in that process. We don't shy away from that. We've obviously got to work out what works, what doesn't work as part of that review process using Luminant, which has been really good. So one of our clients we put on 12 months ago, what took her through the Luminant process, 30-something professional white-collar worker, very sort of financially orientated, wanted to get ahead. So we took her through that initial process. And I think for her, that initial process was a little bit confronting because I don't think she really understood what financial advisors did. And having not been through a process before like that, I think she was quite surprised at the values-based approach to the system we took her through. Positively, I should say. It was a really good experience.
What do you think she expected?
I don't know, actually. I think sometimes people just don't know what they don't know. If they've not been through that process before, they're not really sure what to expect. The outcome of the meeting, having gone through the values and determining what's really important to her values-wise, and then pulling from that where she was from a progress point of view with each one of those values, and then trying to determine some key goals and objectives off the back of that. I think she came out of the meeting saying, well, I wasn't really expecting that, but that was a really positive experience. And look, we've done some advice for her throughout the year. We've taken her right the way through that process. And now we've just sat down with her again and revisited the values. Now, interestingly, we took her back through the values process. And I wasn't sure what to expect, but the values really haven't changed that much, which is probably what you would expect. From people's values, I don't think fundamentally change. However, the order of those values had changed. So her, what she felt was very important 12 months ago maybe wasn't quite as important this year. So there's been a bit of a shuffling of the decks in terms of the priority.
Can you tell me a bit about that? So what in her words or your view, prompted the change in priority, and what became more of a priority and less of a priority?
Yeah, so interestingly, the number one was she wanted to feel more confident with her finances at the beginning of the process. Now, obviously, 12 months on, we've taken her through that process. We've delivered a couple of significant pieces of advice to her. So I think she now feels 12 months on, okay, obviously my finances are still really important to me, but do I feel more confident? Well, yes, I do feel more confident now because we've obviously assisted her with that. So that's something that was front of mind, still important, but has probably shifted down a little bit. And what she's actually flipped to the top is more career orientated. She wants to master new skills, and she's looking to do a master's and some other things. And she's pushed that to the forefront for this year, which has been really interesting. So it was just nice to see how people do, I suppose, pivot on what's important to them. And I think it just really goes to show how important it is to continually review what's important to clients and the goals that come off the back of that.
Yeah, and how did you entertain that discussion? So it's you've obviously done it 12 months ago. You wanted to bring values back up again. You mentioned 12 months ago when you first started, she was a bit taken aback by that, but in a good way. How did you reintroduce values into the discussion that you wanted to revisit them, and what was that discussion like?
Well, obviously having the platform there as the basis, you've already got those values in front of mind. They're there. We can see them.
Yeah, so you can see them on the Lumion screen. Yeah, you track
Exactly,
to them.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And we've also tracked in each of one of those values the progress. So what was she out of 10 last time? So she says, maybe I'm feeling confident with my finances. Maybe she's a 4, right? So we've revisited that, and now she's feeling like a 7 or an 8, which is awesome, right? So she can see the progress from a 4 to a 7. Now, it might sound like small things, but I think to the client, if they can see them moving down a path, they're going to value that. This is what we identified to start with. This is where we are now. You've moved down that path in a positive way. That's awesome, right? So I think that's been that was the really interesting part, is just revisiting each one of those values, showing her the progress that she's achieved on. And some of those are not all us. Like the finance one was obviously us. But certainly what she's doing in her job and her self-education is all her. I think the fact that we had identified it in the early part of the process, and it was on her mind throughout the 12 months, allowed her to track and obviously move forward on that.
So you've revisited it. Was it as simple for you as going through and going into each value? So picking the card and going, you were a 4 12 months ago. How do you feel about your finances now out of 10?
Yeah, so if you remember, if we go through the initial process, we're talking, why did you pick that card and why is that card important to you? So why is that value important to you? So it's almost as simple as revisiting that. You picked this card last year because you felt this way. Is that card still relevant to you? Absolutely, it is. Well, how do you feel you're going? Do you feel you've gone backwards? You've gone forward? Have you stayed the same? How? And I use that word "feel" very deliberately.
Yeah, talk me through that.
Well, I think, we can obviously, as advisors, we can be extremely analytical in terms of how we do things, and that's okay. And that has its place. But I often feel the value in terms of what we do from an advisor's point of view really comes through often in the intangibles. And the client needs to feel the value in an intangible. They can see the value in a tangible because it's there. But in an intangible, they really need to feel it. Do I feel better off? Do I feel like I've made progress? And that verb is very, important to use with the client when you're taking them through that review process. Does that mean?
Yeah, agree. And so you've revisited the values. They've reprioritized, or she's reprioritized the cards. How does that impact your relationship or your advice for the 12 months coming now? Have you changed tact a little bit? Has she changed tact? What's been the impact of revisiting that?
Yeah, so often year 2 less to do than year 1. Not unusual. That's pretty straightforward. It's a refocus process, so you're refocusing on maybe new goals or updating existing goals. So that gives you the direction. And then obviously, what do we need to do from a strategy point of view to make sure that she's achieving those goals going forward? The values are entrenched. We have them. We know that we've got progress reports on how they've been moving forward. We now get into the strategy. So you talk about 2 types of plan almost: the strategic plan, which is I need to get from A to B, and the tactical plan is how you actually do that. What are you actually doing a long way to get you from A to B? So just manage. It really is a refocus, an unpack, repack, for want of a better, that's really what it is, and it gives you then just a clear guideline of what you need to do for the next 12 months.
And how do you feel? So obviously you've been doing values-based advice for a while. First time doing the review with Lumient as your backing. How do you feel as the advisor that process or experience felt for you compared to what you were doing prior to using this?
So definitely more organized, more methodology, obviously there, ready to go. So if I think back to what we used to do, yes, we used to pull out all those values, but they probably were scribbled on yellow bits of paper and stuck in a file, right? So now that they're front of mind, they're what we can go back to and revisit. I think the other thing that, from a practice point of view, anyone in the practice can go in and see those values.
Yeah, great.
So associate advisors, admin staff, para planners, they're all there to be accessed by the firm. Maybe in the old, I say the old days, but a few years ago, it was all in my head or all on a bit of paper. I think now that having, I think your team need to have a better understanding of clients more generally. And that comes being able to have access to that information.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, James, you mentioned you've got another client story for us. Tell us a bit about this client.
Well, I just wanted to give you something completely different, because I think it's what I found is that you just get completely different people. So we had a new client about 6 months ago, what I call a high D type client, director, very direct, to the point. And look, that often clients, you get CEOs and people like that can be like that. Had the initial call with him, got that feeling in my stomach that maybe this values-based approach is not going to work so well with this guy.
yeah, they just want it done.
They just want it done, and you've almost got to stop yourself allowing them to lead you down the path. You've got to stick to your process. So we did that, and we had to really convince him to bring his partner in. We only do meetings with both because I think it's vitally important, as we understand. So got that meeting organised, got them in, started to go through the process, and you could feel the tension, that initial build-up where clients really don't want to be there. You're feeling the pressure, and very much directed to the non-CFO and see the non-CFO first and the CFO. Well, what was interesting as we started to go through the cards, you started to see a complete shift in power.
Wow. Okay.
Between the CFO.
Being the male in this, the husband who's a CEO by trade.
Yeah, not of a huge corporate company, but of a reasonably sized firm. So obviously, and it was amazing to see the shift and the differing of values that they picked out, and the way that they then had to negotiate on those values to get those top 5. And the dynamic on that was quite confronting, to be honest, because
for you,
it wasn't argumentative. I'm not suggesting that for a second, but I think they started to realise how different some of their values were, and how they had to start to align those values in terms of moving forward. So it's maybe all relationships are different, right? But the meeting went on for about 2.5 hours.
Wow,
which was huge. Right, so generally, and look, the outcome was incredibly positive from an alignment point of view. I think they felt that they really probably hadn't talked like this in 10 years, right? Maybe about what was important to them, and it really allowed them to focus on what was really, really important to them. It's just amazing how people come from different sides and maybe don't realize what the other's thinking or what's important to them. Ultimately, they're aligned. They end up being aligned, but they're just coming from different sides and not quite understanding where the other's coming from. And that's how powerful this process can be if you get it right. Now, it doesn't always go like that, but I'm just saying it's really interesting when you do get that, because it does actually make you realize that you shouldn't assume anything.
Yeah.
When it comes to these sort of meetings, which is what I've sort of learned.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you could have, right back at the start when the client engaged you, you could have rightfully, and I'm sure many advisors have done this in the past, assumed that CEO doesn't want to talk about his values. He just knows what's going on. It's all good. And you're stuck to your gut, stuck to your process. I'm interested to unpack it. So let's start with that first bit where you're ultimately trying to get the CEO or this client to come in and, I don't know, for lack of a better term, you've either got to sell yourself or sell him on a values-based advice experience, right? It's important we do this. How did you do that? How did you tackle that conversation?
So we have a part of our process. We have what we call a pre-vet call. We're chatting on the phone with the client to work out how we think we might be able to help them. Are they a fit for us? Yes or no? And often you don't know that 100% until you sit in front of a client, but you got to get a sense of it. So we go through that process, trying to work out, what are the burning issues? What are the things that are important to you right now? Why are you ringing me? No one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to ring a financial advisor today.
It'd be nice.
Generally, it doesn't happen. There's normally a burning issue. So if you can identify that burning issue, that gives you some context. What we often talk about with clients, though, is it's a diagnosis. We need to understand what you're about before we can even work on prescribing anything, solve any problems. If you don't you go to a doctor diagnoses, he can ask you a whole bunch of questions before he even works out what he's going to do. No different in what we do from a values-based point of view. Often, just because your arm hurts doesn't necessarily mean it's your arm.
No, you're right.
And it's the same in financial matters. So what we try and do is try and get the client to understand that we'd like to go through a diagnostic process to work out where they are. We try and paint them a picture of, we do something before we do the Luminant session of what we call after the Luminant session, we do what we current status report. So they really understand where they are before we go forward. And if we can sell that part and get them in, we often find that values process will solve itself, because once you get into that process, they understand very quickly the benefit and what we're trying to achieve. Yeah, but it's getting them in the room.
Well, so let's stay there for a bit. You mentioned you struggled or had to convince him to bring his wife in the room.
Yeah.
How did you convince him in the end? What did you need to say? How did it work?
So it really goes back to that CFO, non-CFO. And what we often find, and what we found, is if you're talking CFO stuff, i.e., let's say you're rebalancing a portfolio or something technical from a tax point of view, often the non-CFO doesn't want to have anything to do with that conversation, not interested, right? He does that or she does that. That's their responsibility. However, when you're talking about things of values and life importance, where we're going to retire, how we're going to retire, how we're going to look after the kids, philanthropy of any sort, they're the conversations the non-CFO is absolutely want to be part of. So the way we sell that is, I often will say to someone like that, I'll say that we're going to have conversations on our own, where maybe your wife, or if it's the other way, your husband does not need to be involved and does not want to be involved. But there are going to be key conversations where you both need to be involved. And I think by trying to split the conversations into two types of conversations, there will be times when we're speaking on our own. There will be times where you both need to be together. I think that helps sell the importance of the meeting, the first meeting anyway.
I like that. So, you're inviting and introducing the concept to the client that we know quite well, right? We know that in a relationship, there's typically a CFO and a non-CFO, one that takes care of all the money matters, all that sort of stuff, one that doesn't and actively doesn't, right? It might be through never being engaged, which we find is quite often the reason, but it also might be, I could be engaged, I actually just don't care, I don't want to. Both are valid reasons. I love that you're inviting that and introducing that type of language into the client so that they can understand, right, okay, I understand that both of us need to be here for some things, and if it's just the money stuff, you'd come straight to me. So it brings them in, right? I like.
Yeah, no, it seems to have worked quite well for us. But I just try and, I suppose, highlight to them that the first meeting is so important, because it does set the foundation for everything that we're doing. And you sell it. You say, obviously, not every meeting is going to be like this, but it's an important one to get right. So if you can, take an hour and a half out of your busy lives to sit down with us and just get this foundation right, the rest of it's going to be a lot easier once we've got that correct.
Now, the last question I want to unpack on this client before we wrap up today is you mentioned you saw a dynamic shift or a power shift in the conversation when you're doing the values from the CFO, who I'm assuming controlled the conversation up to a point, and then the non-CFO who got a little bit more vocal. What did you see? How did you see that come to fruition in the appointment? Was it body language? Was it the fact that one spoke up more? And the second part of that question is, how did you deal with it? What did you do?
Yeah, so often the way of dealing with things like that, when you're getting quite vocal power shifts, is to do nothing. And I mean that quite genuinely. Just listen to what's going on and allow them to do what they need to do. But interestingly, what we had is that because the non-CFO went first, and then she went through her cards and did that, and then he went through his. And interestingly, from that, she was more critical of his cards than he was of her cards. There's a little bit of a flip there, which was interesting. And she was questioning his cards more. He sort of left her cards. And there was a difference in terms of the type of cards that some they aligned on. I think it was 2 they aligned on. The other 3 hers were much more about family, nurturing relationships, that sort of side, which obviously was something very important to her, family-wise. And him being a high D director type, it was all about, we've just got to get this stuff sorted, right? Not uncommon. And I think that was the catalyst that was getting her to push back a little bit on his values. So why is this not important to you? It's important to me. Why is it not important to you?
Wow, what a fascinating conversation to sit back and watch. How did he react to that?
Oh, he goes, no, it is important. You start to see the dynamic. It is important, but I just thought this is more. Like they try and justify the cards. It's quite funny to watch, and it wasn't aggressive.
No,
any way, shape, or form.
But necessary.
But necessary conversation.
Yeah.
And what they actually ended up with was what you see with those values is they start negotiating on what cards are important, and then they start to compromise on what cards are important, and then you end up with what you end up with. And often, some will get some will get others. And finances was a big part. They wanted to feel more confident in their finances, so that was in the top 5. Spending more time with the family was a big one that they negotiated on. Spending without guilt was in there as well, which is an interesting one because they were quite wealthy. Not wealthy. You know what I mean? Like
wealthy enough to
really
assume that you could spend money, right?
But it's interesting how there's still guilt associated with spending, even though you've got money. But again, I'm not assuming anything. I'm just allowing this to unfold. And then obviously that gives you that just amazing foundation for everything you do going forward. Because at any point in the next 12 months, or even after that, you can say, you remember we went through the values? You remember you picked these 5 things, and you've told me why they're important to you. Well, are they still important? Well, yes, they are. So you can always bring it back to the value side. And it's such a powerful thing to bring them back to because they picked it, not me.
Yeah. You're just facilitating. Yeah.
Sure. So, so that was great. It was one of the very unexpected, actually quite rewarding from a process point of view and advice point of view, just to see how those sort of things can unfold.
I love it. 2 fascinating stories, James. That show the impact of values-based advice. One question we always finish on here at the podcast is if you were giving a tip to your peers in the industry who are considering values-based advice that they're just not quite there yet, what might one of the tips be that you would give them as they start to dip their toe in the water with values-based advice?
Yeah, look, the biggest one I've learned certainly this year is really not to assume anything. And I mean that we make assumptions all the time about people, and we're all guilty of it. And I'm guilty of it as anyone else. But what I've learned from the clients we've dealt with this year particularly is what you think the key driver is often not the key driver.
Yeah.
So you've got to allow it to unfold. and by allowing it to unfold, you'll get a much better outcome.
James, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I've got a ton of notes here, but to recap some of the key points, you've spoken to us about a couple client stories where you've taken a client through the full 12 months of their values-based experience, seen them reprioritize and how that shaped the impact of their advice and helped them feel really confident about themselves in getting progress in their values, which is really cool. And the second client, living that never assume that you've just spoken about, getting both the CFO and the non-CFO in the room, staying silent as they negotiate their values and seeing the power that has in a conversation. James, thank you so much for sharing those with us today. I'm sure there's many a best practice in there that people can take home.
Absolute pleasure, Mark. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, James.